Um, Hi, my name is Sarah Seiler. I'm the Regional Healthcare Preparedness Coordinator for the Metrolina Healthcare Preparedness Coalition. This hazard vulnerability analysis education is being brought to you by Triad, Metrolina, and the Mountains. This was a joint partnership between the three regions. I do want to let y'all know before I forget, we are recording this just so that we will be able to post it online for other people to be able to watch later. And I would like to turn it over to Will Moorhead, who will be presenting
Great.
for us.
Thank you. So Sarah, you can, just to confirm, you can hear me okay, right?
Yes, I can. And whenever you would like, I can unmute everyone. And if we have problems, I'll remute them if you would like.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure my audio was right. So yeah, good morning, everybody. I'll do a little introduction in just a minute. Some of you may know me from other projects or things, and I'll do an introduction in a second. If you've ever participated with me, you've heard me say I am ADD and I like to know what in the world we're going to do today before we get into other things. So the objective for today is we want to go over, and I'm going to talk about what HVA, Hazard Vulnerability Assessment, is, and some other terms that are kind of synonyms for that acronym. But we're going to review the components of an HVA and talk about. Wow, I just wanted to close my little side screen there, and talk about how that specifically relates to healthcare providers. And our focus today is both hospitals and ancillary healthcare providers, recognizing that there are different ones of you on the call. And then we want to talk about what the best practices for doing this are. So if you're a healthcare provider, how do you actually go about developing an HVA or taking your current process and improving that? And then there's this whole piece of, if you have that together for your facility, what are the best practices to integrate that with multiple agencies, multiple facilities, or in something like a coalition where you have various disciplines and various agencies. So the agenda is fairly straightforward. I'm going to review some concepts and components of vulnerability assessment. And then I'm going to talk about how to maximize that, and then I'm going to talk about applying those things to a facility, and then we're going to talk about applying those to a community or coalition HVA. And all of this is intended to be a teaser for, or kind of the precursor to some workshops that are coming up, and we'll have more information about that, and Sarah can speak to that. So one thing that we wanted to do at the beginning, and we have the opportunity to use both the question format on the or the chat function of the web meeting, as well as we have the opportunity to just unmute some of you and ask questions. But I was really curious if there was any specific need that anybody had. Oh, there we go. Okay. I was curious if there was any specific question or some concern or anything that we wanted to make sure that we addressed going in. So it's kind of an opportunity for you guys to share a little bit with us before we got too far into introductions or discussion or any of that stuff going forward.
I'm in the process of unmuting everyone, so keep in mind you're unmuted now, so you'll need to use your unmute.
Yeah, I was going to say, use the mute on your screen. You have a little microphone button on the upper right. Probably it's where yours is on the toolbar that you can mute your own. But does anybody have any question, need, concern, anything that we want to make sure we address today? You guys are quiet. So all right, if I'm hearing nothing, I will press on and see what we can, maybe we can stimulate some questions. Hopefully you get enough information that you don't have a ton of questions before we go into the workshops. But and by way of introduction, Sarah mentioned who she is and how this project is rolling out. My name is Will Moorhead. My company is All Clear Emergency Management Group. We are we're a planning, training, and exercise firm is what I usually say, meaning we focus on emergency management, whether it's developing plans, training people on those plans, or exercising those plans. And the reason I'm involved in this project is we do a lot of work with healthcare, and we've worked with the coalition before, with the Metrolina Coalition, and I know the leadership in the other coalitions, and they've participated in projects that we were doing. And so they said, you know, this is a topic we've all talked about, and so I want to give you just a little background. I happen to just have a little experience doing this sort of project, and so I will use references to those and speak from those, but I use the word facilitator very carefully, that I see us as facilitating expertise and information from the participants. And so that said, please take, if you have questions, if you want to share something, there will be some times through today's presentation where you can do that. Please take a minute to, you know, type something in the chat function or to raise your hand. Sarah's watching who's raising their hands, and we're all trying to watch the chat feature, and we want you guys to have some input if you have questions or input or a best practice to share or something like that. So, and I will try to share some examples from our projects just to stimulate some thought or discussion. Yes?
So we actually just did get a question in, and you are going to cover it. But when completing your HVA and filling out the forms, you need to include things that won't affect your facility. So the Kaiser form actually is a perfect example. It's got volcanoes on it and tsunami, which more than likely are not risks for a lot of us in our state. But I do believe you touch on that as you go through the different evaluations.
Yeah, that's great, and that's a good point. And we definitely want to talk about how to make the vulnerability assessment process. I call it practically applicable. Is my phrase for that. So, and that's a very good point. Yeah. So just stop me if you get anything else, Sarah. So the project team for this, as Sarah mentioned, is a mixture of the three healthcare coalitions, and so as a result, the participants. And Sarah, do you want to talk about coalitions before I talk about participants? Do one of you guys want to do that, or do you want me to do that?
I can actually talk about it just a little bit. Several of y'all recognize a lot of the names, and actually we have some coalition leaders on here who probably can answer this question better than I can. But just for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the state is divided up into 8 different regions, and initially it was designed to manage the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response Hospital Preparedness Program funding. Sorry, that was a lot of letters, but I didn't want to use acronyms. And they have since evolved from a grant management program to actually coalition development. So our purpose for each of the regions now is really to enhance the preparedness and response for all of healthcare. That would include hospitals, public health, long-term care, EMS. I sort of jokingly say anyone who may be around a syringe or a pill we should be working with. And our goal is really to make all of our communities more resilient, either by providing planning assistance or occasionally funding assistance. There's not a lot of funding now, so we do a lot of planning. And that's how this came about, is we started having discussions in our region, and there were a lot of people who seemed to be struggling with developing good HVAs, which they are the backbone to all of your planning. And so we decided that we would go back to basics, and because if you can't get your good planning pieces identified, then anything you build on that is going to be built on a very weak foundation. And the regions are actually up on the screen, and so the ones on the left side of your screen actually are the ones that are participating in this officially, but we have had representation from the Eastern region and Southeastern region and the Capital region on some of these calls. I see names popping up.
Good, thanks. And in terms of just introducing the concept of who's on, given the number of you that I show 30 of you participating, so I'm not going to try to introduce you all, but we do have, as Sarah mentioned, there are people from some of the other coalitions participating. We have hospital participation and long-term care facilities, and hopefully there are other ancillary providers. Sarah, you're probably looking at the list and know some of the people. Do you recognize any facility type? Public health?
We do have public health on. We have several hospitals. We have, I believe, some EMS. Yes, we have some EMS on here as well, which is awesome.
Yeah.
We do have emergency management. Michelle Brock from emergency management, which is great. And I think the rest are primarily healthcare, but I'm really glad we've got some emergency management on here because we're really going to rely on you a lot in these workshops because you do this all the time, but it's just not integrated with healthcare, and I think y'all are really going to be able to be leaders with the healthcare and getting them up to speed of where they need to be.
Yeah, and that's a great point. You know, again, from back to the facilitation point, my goal is to facilitate, and our goal as the project team is to facilitate the integration of information and ultimately the integration of HVAs. Again, I'm going to use that term HVA sort of generically for just another minute, but the idea is that some of you, and particularly today, some of you, I'm going to focus on some facility issues and don't apply to all of you. And for others of you, yet at this moment, the idea of regional or integrated HVAs may not apply. And so just bear with us and think about how it all ultimately connects in the bigger community scheme. And so we'll talk through some of those things. Let me drive ahead and kind of just, as Sarah said, the vulnerability assessment really is a foundational piece. And so let's start with, you know, most of us are familiar with the graph up to the right, the emergency management cycle or the visual where we talk about mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And the idea of these is often, I think, skewed in that there's, you know, if you look at other charts of this, there's a very distinct color block, and it appears that mitigation is sort of stops and preparedness begins, and then preparedness ends and response begins, and then the response ends and the recovery begins. And the truth is, this graphic is a little more accurate in that they sort of blend together. And you know, you can think about when we have a big response. Typically within hours or the first day of a big event, some community leader comes out onto the news media or out to the news media and says one of the first things they say to the public is, "We will recover." And so in the midst of the response, we're already thinking about getting back to normal. And really, so to me, the bottom graphic kind of visually displays the concept that these things are all overlapping. And so our vulnerability assessment is similar to these. It sort of permeates all levels of our planning and response because we should be thinking about it and using it for preparing and planning, and obviously to accomplish mitigation actions. We should have some organized approach to identify and prioritize what needs to be mitigated. But as we respond, we need to, and as we recover, we need to think about what went right, what could we do better, where were we right or wrong in our assessment. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. But this really is a universal concept that works throughout all of our emergency management. I mentioned, and we've already alluded to, the idea that both agencies and communities assess their hazards. Based on what they assess, they plan and equip their agency or their response. They train and exercise based on that. And so to the question about assessing a volcano, most of us probably don't plan and equip for volcanoes because we've assessed our hazards and determined that that's not probable. In most cases, it's a fairly agency-specific concept, and most of us should be doing or do, and that's our primary function, is to conduct an agency-specific vulnerability assessment. But ultimately, we need to, as we respond, at some point we're going to integrate with the community. And so when we request assets or when we're trying to support somebody else's response, it's helpful to know what their vulnerabilities are, and it's helpful for us as a group to, in order to be able to lend and receive aid effectively and to work with one another, we need to know where one another's limitations are and the challenges that we might face. And so that's where we kind of start with the concept of focus on your agency, get good information for your agency, and then let's talk as a bigger group to figure out how we as a larger group can integrate. And I'm going to walk through that here in just a minute. I want to hit on something that really kind of drives the point home. I stole this graphic, this picture, straight out of the NIMS materials, the National Incident Management System materials, because to me it really drives a great point home. We often talk about interoperability, and we talk about how we all can communicate together. And so we focus on that brown circle, the technical interoperability. And so does my radio talk to your radio? And that's important. That's a really important piece because we need to make sure that we can communicate. But then if we are, we have to communicate using similar terms and similar language, if you will. And so that's semantic interoperability. But then also there's process interoperability. Do we conduct ourselves when we're managing an emergency in a similar manner? And all of these kind of permeate how we assess our vulnerability, particularly when we look at a community vulnerability assessment, because as we look at that community vulnerability assessment and we're trying to determine between healthcare, emergency management, public health, ancillary healthcare providers, EMS, fire departments and other first responders, when we're trying to look at, and then community agencies like Public Works, and we're trying to figure out how we all work together, we have some technical piece that needs to work together, but we also need to be basically speaking the same language, and we all need to be operating under a similar process. And so our vulnerability assessment incorporates this. We should be working off of this planning process. And again, we've alluded to this several times, but this is what we're alluding to. We conduct a hazard assessment, and then we develop plans based on that hazard assessment. And of course, I hope that we would all agree in today's world it's impossible to identify every hazard, exactly how every hazard will impact. And so typically we conduct we create an all hazards plan, and then based on our assessment we may create a hazard specific annex to that all hazards plan. So the all hazards plan says this is generally how we will respond and manage within our facility or within our community, but then there are things like hurricanes or acts of terrorism that have some specific issues that we can plan specifically for, and because their threat is so high, we take the time to develop a hazard-specific annex. Once we develop that plan, of course, we have to educate some people on that plan, the users of that plan, and hopefully we get some feedback from them, and that creates some revision of the plan. You know, some of them say, oh, this will work, this won't work. And so we revise our plan, and based on that revision, then we educate everybody. We say, all right, now here's the revised plan. This is what we're going to do. This is how we would respond. And so let's practice that, and we conduct an exercise. Of course, then once we do the exercise and we practice this in real time, we learn lots of things that what went right, what went wrong, what could we do better type of things. And so we revise our plans again based on the exercise. And you could also insert response over the word exercise. And so once we respond, we learn things, and hopefully we revise our plans. But then when we respond or when we exercise, then we should go back and reassess. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute once we go through the process and talk about how we could reassess. So that's the process we're basing our assessment on. And so this is where I've said I'm using the phrase HVA. Now, we mentioned there are lots of you on the call or on this webinar with us. There are emergency managers who often use THIRA or THERA or however you choose to pronounce that acronym, the Threat Hazard Identification Risk Assessment. Some of us utilize a gap analysis or perform a gap analysis on a plan or a document or a process. Some public health agencies call it a local risk assessment, depending on where we are and what the process is. There may be other terms that we use for this. For today's purpose and for the purpose of this project, we're going to kind of use HVA as a generic term that incorporates all of these specific things, because there are some specific nuances to conducting a THIRA or some nuances to conducting a particular agency vulnerability assessment. And we're trying to kind of go over the basics and then, you know, get into, we can help you better understand some of those nuances as we go. So if we can all agree and we'll just kind of call it an HVA, understanding that these other things exist. So before I go farther, I'm just going to remind you guys that you can write a chat question. I don't know what the mute situation is, so just write a chat question. Sarah will interrupt me. I certainly don't want to drive too fast by something before everybody gets it. So, but what I want to do now is kind of break down HVA as a process and talk about.
Some cylinders are not good, like you can have usually pretty good.
Somebody's unmuted. Question?
Well, I was trying to get people unmuted that were new logging on, but they don't all have their mute on. So
Gotcha.
I will do my best, but if you want to talk and you're not unmuted, if it says we muted you, just tell me, I'll unmute you.
Okay, yeah, that's an easy way to do it. Yeah, now I hear feedback.
Hold on, I'll fix that one too. There we go.
All right. Okay, so yeah, we'll probably stick with the chat piece then, and then we can unmute as needed to have conversation, or raise your hand on the button. So let me walk through the components of an HVA and kind of break this down. And remember, some of you, as Sarah said, some of you, this is a regular process. For others of you, you're still kind of struggling with this, and so hopefully we can bring you up to speed, and then when we go to the workshops, we can all work together to utilize the various perspectives and the various levels of information to bring it all together. So, the way an HVA starts is that we look at typically, and I'm going to use kind of a common process. We look at what the event is. Or the series of events that may impact us. And so those may be natural hazards, they may be man-made hazards, but there's some events or risks that may impact us. And then we talk about the probability of that. And so again, to the question that's been asked, we might look at hurricane, tornado, active shooter, and volcano. But then we look at the probability of those. And so we may be able to eliminate some things like volcano because the probability is so inherently low based on, and we're going to talk about how we determine probability, based on what we know of the geology of our area in western North Carolina, to the history and other things. But then we can talk about the probability of other things like tornadoes and hurricanes is a little higher, and so we want to analyze then what would be the impact if it happened. So if a tornado happens or if an active shooter happens, what's the impact? And then some models talk about the duration of that. And you can think about, and I'm going to show you some examples from, say, Kansas, where they incorporate duration into their vulnerability assessment. they actually incorporate warning and duration because to them the tornado lasts a couple of minutes, but the duration of their immediate response might be a couple of days. They may be in sort of emergency mode. It doesn't mean they won't be damaged or impacted for some time, for several weeks or months. And you can think about South Carolina right now, and some of you who know me know that I'm originally from South Carolina, and actually some of my very closest friends, and I've lived within blocks of where the heaviest flooding and dam breaches are happening right now. So I'm getting a lot of information there, and it's kind of fresh on my mind. The warning time of that was fairly great. The duration has been several days. It doesn't mean that for months to come people won't be impacted, but right now they're still sort of in emergent mode. And so that is a longer duration emergent mode than, say, an active shooter where we're in emergent mode during the period of dealing with the shooter and dealing with the injuries, and maybe then just the initial organization of, hey, what's next for our agency. But beyond that, it's a fairly short duration. Again, it doesn't mean people aren't emotionally or physically impacted for years to come. It just means the actual response. But then finally, we talk about preparedness and how well prepared are we? Do we have the ability to notify people to evacuate when a hurricane is coming? Do we have the ability to respond effectively to a hazardous materials event? And so those are the kind of big areas that I want to talk about and focus on for how we assess risk and impact. And so it's easier for me as a visual learner to use some visual examples. I do not love this example in front of you, but it is a very visual example. And so I want to walk through it, and we'll use this as the foundation for some of our conversation. I got two or three more of these to show you. You see on the left side of the screen, we have events, and so this might be things like tornadoes, severe snowstorm, wildfire, violence in the facility, and then we look at probability. How probable, what's the likelihood that this event will occur? If it does occur, then the peach-colored, I think that's peach-colored, I don't have all my Crayola memorized, but what's the impact if it does happen? Human impact, property impact, business impact. And so we talk about to the people, to the physical locations, and to the operations, what's the impact? And then I'll call it purple, Crayola probably calls it something more creative. Those bluish, purplish columns talk about how well prepared are we? What's our internal capability for our agency, or then external to us, what's the capability? And before I break these down, let me just show you a couple of others. This is the Kansas model that they use in healthcare, and again, same thing. You have bomb threat, workplace violence, tornado, severe thunderstorm over on the left side, and those are, if you look, you see both natural and man-made hazards. And then you see probability, and then human, facility, and property impact, and then this is where, again, I mentioned warning time and duration. And then there's the purple columns. These are, I think, clearly purple. Planning, and then for them it was what level of plans do we have, and then what level of training and equipment. And so, well, and let me just show you one more before I start talking about these. This one is a community HVA. This community broke their events down and added some things that didn't just focus on one particular facility. They focused on their county. And so they said, what are the events that impact us? What's the probability that this will take place? Then they looked at impact, but they talked about human, property, business. And then for them as a community, they said, but there are some critical facilities as well. And then they also talked about agency, meaning our county, how well prepared are we? And then regionally. So in their example, they said our county has a fairly limited response capability for hazardous materials, but we're only 45 minutes away from a huge metropolitan area. We have an agreement with their incredible hazmat team, and so they can be here very quickly in terms of hazmat. Quick, and so they can be here quickly, and so we have great support from an outside agency. So what this gives us, whether it's this model or any of the models, what the idea is that they all create, over on the right, a relative risk. And so the relative risk does not total 100%. You can have three things that are 48% relative risk. The idea is to give some number, and there's math that's involved with this, and the math changes depending on the model you're looking at. Again, we're in kind of a 101 class today, so we won't get into all that detail. But the relative risk just allows us to see, wow, that has a greater risk relative to the other things than we expected. And so what we're able to do with these tools or these resources, whether it's these tools or others, again, each process has a different tool. I just think these are very visual. We're able to look at and break down where we are particularly strong or vulnerable. And so we can talk about, wow, that has a tremendous human impact. What could we do to reduce the human impact? Or, wow, we really have a terrible capability within our agency. How could we improve preparedness? If our agency's low and it's going to take $1 million to get a hazmat team, maybe we can sign an agreement regionally, and that will increase the overall preparedness. So I'm going to break these down a little bit and talk through it a little more, but again, I think these are just visual examples, so just kind of lock these in your brain for a minute, and let me talk about how to maximize these, because I think each of them has some weakness, and I think each of them has some things that we need to talk about. When we talk about the event or the risk, I think it's really important that we define and differentiate the risk. And what I mean is, you noticed on that last slide I showed you, they had broken down snowfall 0 to 3 inches, 3 to 6, 6 to 12, or greater than 12 or something, I don't remember. But for them, that was different than, I see a lot of vulnerability assessments that say snowstorm or winter weather. Well, I've done a lot of work in Colorado and on vulnerability assessment, and I learned something very interesting there, is that, or I've learned from people who experience this firsthand, and I know I'm talking to a bunch of people in North Carolina, so snowstorm, those are white flakes that fall from the sky when it's very cold. Sometimes they accumulate on the ground. I know we don't see it much in the southeast anymore, and it causes chaos. That's the other thing. There's no bread or milk. But in Colorado, to them, it really gets broken down into depth of snowfall and how long that sticks around versus the rate of snowfall combined with wind. And so then you start talking about, they have different impacts, right? One is a blizzard, and it creates, and the National Weather Service defines them differently, but it creates a visibility problem. It creates transport problems. Blizzard creates very deep snow drifts. But typically that storm is over within a day or so, and they're able to begin recovery, whereas they also have a very deep, very long snowfall that will drop 2 or 3 feet of snow, and it'll stick around because of the cold temperatures for days. And so in 2007 they had an event in eastern Colorado that started, strangely enough, with a blizzard, and then it dumped enough snow to stay for several days, to the point where they were, the ranchers were losing cattle through starvation, and because there was just simply no access. The snow was so deep. In some places it was 8 and 12, and I've actually seen the pictures. It was deeper than the plows. It was really interesting. It was 8 and 12 foot deep drifts. That's a different hazard than, say, an ice storm. But even an ice storm has 1/4 of an inch of ice is very different than 3/4 of an inch of ice. And anybody that works with a utility knows that utilities get very concerned about the buildup of ice on lines. And so, because a small amount of ice won't bring the lines down, or won't even bring as many trees down, but enough ice will just bring the lines down on their own, let alone the trees that'll take lines down. So we have to define the hazard. What are we talking about? And so when we get to the workshop, that's one of the things we're going to do in the workshop, is help each other better define our hazards so that we're all operating off the same sheet of music. And that's kind of going to be a theme of what I'm going to say over the next couple of slides, is that we all are on the same page. So how do we do that? How do we define those hazards? Well, we have to look at facts and history. we have to look at what, and again, to the volcano point, geologically speaking, factually speaking, that's probably not a hazard in North Carolina, because there just aren't any geologically active or present. And historically speaking, we have to think about, you know, there is the potential for certain things to happen, but the actual event just may not. It may have happened once 150 years ago, but history and progress have taken that factor away. And then we have to talk about, is it actually happening at all? And so once we define our events, we're sort of blending immediately into that probability. And we almost create those two lists simultaneously, but we have to focus on probability, because probability is tricky. History, the trends, the developments, and the things I think about is, for a lot of you, hazardous materials, a transportation hazmat event has gone up or down depending on, have your railroads closed? There's a lot of change in railroad through a lot of community. Or we do work in North Dakota. For them, crude oil is a big deal. And actually one of our clients in the city of West Fargo sent us, right after we did an exercise on a crude oil explosion, sent us a picture from the real crude oil explosion that they were having, or the crude oil train derailment that they were having at that moment. And so for them, the trend and development and the change is increasing their probability of a transportation hazmat event. For some of you, interstates coming through or a plant or factory being built, we look at history when we talk about weather and weather-related events, but then there are things like active shooter that are really hard to determine the probability, because one person in your completely stable organization in society, one person could change that. And so it's really difficult. So there we have to talk with law enforcement and figure out what are the trends that are happening in the community. We have to talk with mental health providers and figure out what are they seeing in general in the community. We have to look at the rate of gun violence, and to some extent there is a subjective piece to this as much as there is an objective piece to this, and that's important to not try to completely eliminate the subjective piece. Are there schools or high-profile targets in our community? And we have to look at all of those things when we talk about probability. So, but then as we do this, I'm going to just back up and walk through these because I got a slide out of order, I think. We have to look at the impact. And again, just to kind of make my point, I'm going to back up. If you look at this is the Kaiser Permanente tool. Tons of healthcare agencies use this. We look at impact and we look at human, property, and business impact. The question I always have is, if we're talking about a hospital, which humans are we referring to? Are we assessing the impact to our staff, or are we assessing the impact to the humans in the community? Those are two different impacts to our facility, which then have two different impacts to our business. And then my question is, what does low, moderate, high actually mean? And if you look at this Kansas model, they at least went to a 4-point scale and said 4 means multiple deaths, 1 means injuries treatable with first aid. So what their human impact, and they, by the way, and we'll talk about this in the workshop, they develop a tool that parallels this, sort of a worksheet that they use along with this, and it defines each of these columns and each of these phrases. And so for them, they define human impact as those people who may require services from our healthcare facility. But at least we have something, we have some percentage when we talk about property or facility impact. We have some percentage or some number to work with. Whereas if we look at low, moderate, high, well, that's moderate to Will, but to Sarah it might be high. But what do we really mean, and what is that in terms of something that's objective or quantifiable? So we really do want to all be on the same sheet of music. We want to be on the same page with what's happening. So if you look to these tools, you'll see how the level of detail is increased, and you'll see how there's more information provided. And the same would be true. There'd be definition if you look at this Kansas model. We see workplace violence, tornadoes, severe thunderstorm, winter storm, and then they define ice, snow, low temperatures. And so for them, they take away some of the subjective piece. Again, same thing happened in this model that you're looking at. There's an ice storm. There's 3 different variations of snowstorm. Extended rain, flooding, is different for them than flash flooding because they have a river in their community, and so that rises rapidly. That's different than they also have events where, like what's happening right now in South Carolina, where rain has occurred over a period of time, and it creates flooding that sticks around for a week. They did the same with tornadoes. So you begin to see that we have to define the level of detail. In order to maximize all of this, there has to be detail. So how do we get all that information? Who do we go to? And I know a lot of you in healthcare facilities are thinking about this and saying, gosh, I get stuck with or I get saddled with this vulnerability assessment annually. And so, again, one of the things we're going to talk about in the workshops is how to build a team and how to gather that information. So there are some external and internal partners that we suggest or that might be useful for your development of your assessment. Your local emergency manager, and so that's why Sarah mentioned we turn to those folks because they have vulnerability assessments for their communities, but they also are invested in the communities and really understand where some of the vulnerabilities are, and they meet with local emergency planning committees and talk about hazardous materials, and they understand what the facilities are within their community. You may have a healthcare coalition, or you may or may not be plugged into your healthcare coalition. We hope you are, but again, that's healthcare providers from around your community who are focusing on the activities and the capabilities of the healthcare providers within that region or that coalition. Public health, I'll never forget, I was asked to do a countywide vulnerability assessment, and one of the events that everybody identified was pandemic influenza. And then we looked around the room, and the public health people had not arrived. And so the challenge there was that for public health, we can't talk about how probable pandemic influenza is until we have the people who are experts in understanding what the vulnerability and impact of that are. Internally, within your facility, you may look at a multidisciplinary committee, and so you might want to have facilities. If you're a healthcare agency, you might want to have physicians, nurses, or somebody that represents them and understands the staffing capabilities and understands the performance capability of each of those groups. And again, when we get to the workshops, that's one of the things we're going to share with one another is how to do this better. So I basically I went over some of these things when we talk about risk and impact. I went over this with the visual example. I've talked about how to assess impact, and I've talked about the duration in terms of, do we have a warning time, do we have event time versus response time, and that's my example of how long does the tornado last, which is a couple of minutes, versus we're in emergency response mode for a couple of days. Preparedness, I've kind of alluded to this in terms of the internal and external preparedness. Do we have, how well prepared are we? Do we have plans? Are our people trained? Do we have equipment? Essentially what we're assessing is capability versus capacity. A great example to that is a hospital said to me years ago, we have a really good hazardous materials decon capability. We have that capability within our agency. The challenge that we have is that if we have more than, and they gave their number, whatever it was, we have no support. Our community doesn't have hazmat support, and there are no other hospitals around to support us, and so we're sort of on our own for some period of time. And I think that's a good, they have a tremendous capability. There's just not a lot of capacity to expand that. So we'll look at each of these, and what we're going to do in the workshops is break these down and talk about how we can analyze them both facility and agency-wide. So let me just pause. Any questions, or again, I'm trying to watch. Sarah, have you received any questions?
I've been able to handle all of them. We're good, I think.
Okay. So we want to talk about how to maximize this thing and utilize this. So in terms of taking your vulnerability assessment and making something useful out of it, I alluded to this early on, that you can use it for improvement planning. And what we mean is you can look and say, well, we scored this low or we scored this high, so this is where we can improve. We can develop mitigation strategies, meaning we can reduce particular hazards by saying, wow, okay, this was really high. How do we address that? We were very unprepared, so maybe we need to create a level of preparedness or create a hazmat capability. Similarly, we can say we need to plan and train and exercise based on the things that we see and based on the particular events that we've occurred. So we look at those numbers. Each of those numbers provides us with some information. We can create an improvement plan. This is an exercise improvement plan. It's the exact same thing that you would see following an exercise, but it's the same concept. What's the critical area? What do we recommend we do? So if we say, wow, we scored very low in preparedness, there might be 3 or 4, or our response capability is very low. We might have 3 or 4 recommendations, and then we can describe specifically how we correct that. We assign somebody who's primarily responsible for that, so that then we can go and determine when to complete it and how to complete it. So I want to talk about practical HVA development, but again, I'm going to pause for just a second and see if anybody has any questions, and I'm trying to read what's in front of me.
I actually do have a question that popped up from Pat Fugate. Is there any intent to develop a different format for the HVA, or are we using the Kaiser Permanente throughout this process? Pat, you'll have to, I'm going to throw out a couple of extra questions to you to make sure that we're saying the right thing, we're giving the right answer. Are you referring to as the state or the regions coming up with their own unique HVA, or are you referring more to ways to adapt for your own internal facility a current existing template? I think she's trying to get herself unmuted. Oh, here she comes. She's typing.
So, yeah, we'll drag our feet for that answer.
So yeah, as of I can answer one question. As of right now, we have not intended to develop a specific regional or state workshop or HVA for all of us to use. She did just type back that she's actually referencing during the workshop. What are we going to use in the workshop when we're trying to kind of develop the group HVA? So Will, you're on with that one.
Yeah. So, well, the workshop is going to focus on developing facility HVAs, because good information at a facility then gives us good information regionally. And so what I mean by that is if we get to the point regionally where we say what are our risks, and we say, well, loss of a hospital, but the hospitals don't, and I'm just throwing this out, but the hospitals don't really know what their vulnerabilities are, then we can't really assess that accurately for the community. So we will focus on improving whatever the particular agencies bring, or taking some of these existing models and improving on them. Regionally speaking, we have not engaged yet, and Sarah and I have talked about this some, we've not engaged yet in developing a regional HVA, but more being able to take the information and how we combine that, and I'll talk about that in just a minute when we talk about combining regionally. But we actually are doing a couple of projects right now where the regions are trying to develop their own regional assessment, and it gets fairly complicated. So we actually want to talk about that with the participants at these workshops and say, what makes sense in your region and what information, what hazards do you think about it? And we want to kind of start down that road, but we are not developing a particular tool. The look of, you notice that the look of most of the tools is based off of some sort of a Kaiser look, and that's just because it puts numbers in a block and creates a relative risk, and so it's an organizational method. So we're definitely going to talk about how to improve that process. But there's a Canadian model that that doesn't use a visual tool like that at all, and it's a very, very, very detailed process that is incredible. But so I'm sort of beating around the bush to say we aren't really intending to develop a regional HVA, more to set the stage for that and to get good quality information out of the facilities. Did I answer that, Sarah, or anybody? Did that make sense?
It was a little circuitous,
Yeah.
but the gist is we will not have like a set HVA that we're expecting every hospital to use as their template. If you have one that you use currently, bring that with you to the workshop. Otherwise, we'll build on ones that people already know. But
Yes.
if that winds up being a gap that is identified, that is definitely something we could look at sort of in phase 2 of this. Do we want to look at coming up with, with a simplified template for everyone to use, so we're at least on the same page from that standpoint?
Yes. Okay. So let me talk about how the practical piece and some of the things we're going to talk about facility-wise now we're going to really build on later, and then again my kind of circuitous answer, in just a second I'm going to enhance or expand on some of the regional discussion. To do this at a facility, to really get good information, there are a couple of things. One is there's the information I just talked about in terms of really analyzing your particular tool, your assessment tool, and really getting good information into that. But again, I mentioned a lot of you are often stuck doing this on your own at your facility, whether you're a healthcare facility or an emergency management agency or whatever. So best practices that we've seen from other agencies is that often they divide and conquer, and so they may assign a group of people or one or two people to just brainstorm all of the possible events. Or let's say we all agree this is the list of events on the left side of our tool. Then Bob, Sally, Jane, you take 1 through 5 and you score those. And then Jack, Sue, and Bob, you take 6 through 10 and you score those. And they kind of give their initial answers. And then the group as a whole gets together and sort of deconflicts or just confirms those answers. And that way it just moves things along. It kind of divides up the workload a little bit. We may do it in small portions. We may meet and say, and I did this with a county, we were doing their HVA, and we met and talked through the tool, and we did their probability, and then we came back and we said, based on the probability, the next meeting, everybody be prepared to score the top 7 hazards that we think, the top most probable hazards. And so we scored those. And then everybody, we didn't have a third workshop. Everybody from home scored the remaining things, and then I compiled the information. So we broke it into small, manageable portions because everybody was busy and didn't have a lot of time to work on it. So I think, in one regard, it's just the focus that needs to happen. Another piece to this is, and that I am passionate about.
Muted.
Sarah, am I on?
Unmuted.
Hello? It says I'm talking.
You are on right now.
All right, good. Okay. So another piece that I'm fairly passionate about is capturing your root cause or your justification. And what I mean is if you're a healthcare agency and you're a user of the Kaiser tool, there's a comments column on the far right to the right of the relative risk. And most of the tools that, that I've seen have something like that. And the reason is because as you go through, I mentioned just a slide or so ago how we utilize this in terms of improvement planning and those sorts of things. As you go through and you score these things, if you score the human impact very high, it's important to indicate what that is, because that's really how, and I showed you the improvement plan, you really ought to be able to go down that list and say, wow, what did we write about human impact from a blizzard? And so maybe there's something that you wrote in there that can lead you to, this is something we can do to fix it. If there is no, if you say, wow, we can't address the human impact, but what we could do is address our level of preparedness, you begin to really understand why. And the why piece of it is something that I have kind of a comical example, but it really drives the point home. Years ago, we did a vulnerability assessment project and integration of HVA with healthcare, public health, and emergency management, and really anybody that would attend, but those were the three primary agencies that attended regionally. We did this statewide project, and each region we did a workshop in. And so we asked them all to bring their HVAs and talk about it, and we would begin integrating them. And so this was a mountainous western community, and everybody scored snowfall very low, except for the hospital, which scored snowfall fairly high. And so I said, and everybody in the room was kind of like, well, why, hospital, do you have snowfall very high? I mean, you know, we're a snowfall state. We know how to deal with it. And they said, here's the thing. We have a 96-hour plan for everything except for our linens. Our linens come over the mountain pass from the metro area into, and this was a fairly geographically, it's like 5 counties, but it was a geographically isolated region. And they said, so our linens come over, we have 48 hours worth, and they come over the pass. And so if we lose the pass for more than 2 days, we have a problem. And you know, there's a way around, but it's several hours and really adds about a day to the travel when it's snowing. So all of a sudden, the emergency managers and the public health people started scoring snowfall very differently. And I said, wait. Is the problem snowfall, or is the problem loss of the pass? And then they were all like, oh yeah, well, we need to add that. And so they started adding loss of the pass. And I said, but wait. Of course, I'm, you know, just that's my job, is to play devil's advocate with everything. And I said, so is it really the pass from an avalanche, or could this happen in the summer? And they were like, yeah, okay, we agree. You know, the pass is an important piece. And I said, but for all of you, it sounds like we need to assess loss of the pass and see how that impacts you. And they all agreed, you know, how that impact their businesses and things. But then we said, in terms of this problem with the hospital, community-wide, and that was our focus, was a community-wide assessment of vulnerability. Is the problem loss of the pass, or is actually the problem loss of the hospital? And they all agreed that really what scares public health and emergency management and EMS and everybody else is that if the hospital goes down. So then our root cause, we had to look at what were the things that could create loss of the hospital, and what's the probability of loss of the hospital, and what's the impact if the hospital's lost, what's the duration of that loss, what is our planning and preparedness for loss of the hospital, still different from loss of the pass. Because loss of the pass has different human impact. It does impact the hospital, but in a different way than if the hospital was struck by a tornado or flooded or something. So you see that to me, the root cause justification is a really important piece. The other kind of best practice that I've seen, and I really like, and we've used it in some places, is kind of twofold. To gather your information, sometimes you just need good perspective for inputting into your assessment tools. So utilize some scenario-based discussion and actually talk through and kind of do your HVA almost as you're doing a tabletop. So as you talk through how well we would respond, or read your after action reports, or however you would do this. But sometimes it's a little easier for people, particularly if you're using a committee, it's a little easier for them to get their head around talking through a scenario than it is trying to score a tornado. And so, but the scenario provides the details of that tornado. So again, now we're all singing from the same sheet of music. We understand what tornado means. We're not talking about a tornado in the community. We're talking about a tornado that struck our campus. It didn't flatten our hospital, but it landed on our campus and it created these issues. And so let's score it that way. And so they talk through and they analyze it based on that. Other people have tried to do the same, or have done the same thing using scenarios and hypotheticals, but they do it in terms of questionnaire. If these things happened, how do you believe this, this, and this would be impacted? It's a fairly short questionnaire, but it goes out to a lot of different people. And so now, instead of a committee of 5 or 6, you might get survey results back from 15 or 20 people in the organization. So there's a lot of ways to get more detailed information. What we're trying to avoid through those situations is to say, is the situation where somebody's looking at the assessment and they say, you know, I honestly don't know what that would be like. I mean, I've never really thought about how a tornado would impact us. Or somebody says, well, I don't know, we should have asked so-and-so in facilities. Oh, well, let's just press on. And so we're trying to avoid that and get good information so that we have that for our root cause justification. The other things I've seen that work in a facility is they use a committee. There's some competition they might launch within their committee, you know, for it might be as simple as candy bars, you know, whoever gets their stuff done or can provide, you know, the best presentation or most interesting examples or whatever. Somehow they create a competition, or they just engage people in sort of a fun way so that they see this as not just a meeting they have to suffer through, but something that they enjoy. I think it's something I saw recently was just they created a new committee. They brought in some new faces, and an example I can give you from that is I worked with a huge hospital in upstate New York on their training and exercise program, or their training and exercise plan, and a young woman was a nurse in there, and she said, as we were talking about some training they needed, she gave an example, and she said, hey, you know, look at Will, I'm 6'2", 195 pounds, and she said, look at me, and she's all of like 5 feet and, you know, 0 pounds, and she said, if he's my patient, let alone some of our patients that are twice Will's size, how am I going to evacuate them in an emergency? And she was just a fresh perspective. There were lots of she had just been promoted and just been brought into this committee, and there were lots of senior people who had just sort of forgotten what it was like to be on the floor and to be moving patients and managing patients. And so she had a great perspective, and so I think that's a really good idea. And sometimes you just energize some kind of up-and-coming people to be involved. Regardless of who's conducting your HVA, recognize them either by formal recognition of just sending out a mass email saying thank you to these people for helping us do that, or recognize them by acknowledging their work when you're developing plans or exercises. I was in an exercise recently, and they said we were facilitating a full-scale exercise, and they said we're doing this because of 2 reasons. Our HVA identified the need to do this. It's an active shooter exercise, and our HVA identified the need to do this. And the other reason that we're doing this is because we just had an event where, and everybody knew about this event, but the event was that a gun was suspected on campus. And it turns out they never found a gun, but the report came in that there was a man with a gun on campus, and so that created all sorts of chaos. And so they said, based on those 2 things, we need to do an exercise or an exercise series to really figure out and some plan development. And so that recognized the people who had participated in that HVA and let them know that their work was actually being acknowledged. That's my legitimized through use. If you actually use the HVA, it lends legitimacy to it. And then finally, I think it's really important, and all of the materials that are written by people smarter than me talk about, that are written on the topic of HVA, all those materials say you really should review your HVA after an event. Because what do we learn in an event? We learn the quality of our response. We learn, do we have capability and capacity, or do we just have a bunch of stuff that we don't really know how to use? And so that might change our preparedness. It's not insulting anybody. It's helping us identify. And for that matter, it may help us increase or to decrease increase or decrease some things based on how good we did. We might say, you know, that really didn't go as bad as we thought it would, so maybe we can change our scores for the positive. So that's kind of the facility look at this. I just want to give you a couple of examples about the regional look at this, and again, these are all things that we're going to dig into in more depth in the workshop. But if we have good facility information, as I mentioned a minute ago, if we have good facility information and we understand whether it's EMS or a hospital or a public health agency, we understand what their vulnerabilities are, then when we come to the table as a group, we can combine that information. So again, my loss of the past, loss of the hospital example, right? But that's the root cause that we as a group have to understand. I think it's very important that we consider regional risks versus agency risks. And again, that's a root cause thing. But if we think about the risk, the impact, or even the level of preparedness, at an agency, at a facility, that's very different. So most hospital HVAs have loss of medical gas as a risk, or they have active shooter as a risk. The truth be told, loss of medical gas is not likely to be a regional event because there are regional resources that can support that one hospital to keep the hospital running. It's a problem for them at the hospital to figure out, but if they have a contract or an agreement in place locally, they can bring a loss of a generator is the same way. They can bring a generator in. They can bring a medical gas support in, and so they're able to reduce their risk. But the likelihood that all 10 facilities in a metro area lose their medical gas simultaneously is pretty low. So we have to look at what are those regional risks, and to me, active shooter kind of drives that home. I saw a regional HVA recently where they had taken all the facility HVAs and they combined them. Well, most of the facilities have a significant concern about active shooter because they have employee issues, and they have violence in their emergency departments, and they have gang shootings that, you know, that sometimes the people come back to finish things off, and so they have all those issues that create active shooter or shooting on campus or something as a risk to the healthcare facility. But when you combine them all, and let's say, you know, there's 15 community agencies, 7 of those are hospitals, you combine all the hospitals, and all of a sudden, you know, a couple of the community agencies might be the government building or something, you know, and they have a concern about active shooter, and so all of a sudden that looks like a regional risk. And while it's probable to happen, does it actually create a vulnerability to the healthcare capability or a vulnerability to the overall capability of the region? And what I mean by that is active shooters typically, and I read a news article yesterday, you know, the largest number of injured, Aurora had 70, there were a couple that were 50 injured. And then, you know, it's usually 12 to 15 on average, 7 to 15 dead. And so let's, again, I know each community is different, but let's take that and say the Metrolina region. That's really not a regional risk because there's so many healthcare facilities and so much deceased management capability that it's just not likely to overwhelm the resources and capability of that region. A bus accident is an example. A bus accident in a metro area is 35 to 55 patients. That's different than in a rural area where there's one hospital, one EMS system supported by a volunteer EMS system. They could very easily be overwhelmed. Those are very different hazards. So we have to talk about a regional hazard versus an agency hazard. So it may not be bus accident. It might be mass casualty with X number of people. And so we have to talk about what's our regional preparedness, not just our agency preparedness. So again, there are the variations in agencies and disciplines. The impacts are different, again, as I mentioned, based on geography and resources. As I just said, a rural, I can't say that word, a remote area versus a metro area. And then my hospital example, again, the loss of the past, an impact to a facility may create regional consequences. So that's why we really wanted to do this project twofold, or in two phases. We've got to have a good understanding of what is it that you as facilities are vulnerable to. And if we're all looking at and analyzing with the same quality and the same level of detail, then we can better understand which of those things can rise to the occasion of becoming a regional event, or which of those things could happen simultaneously and impact me, you, Bob, Jack, Sue, and 4 or 5 of us simultaneously, that creates a regional consequence. So that's why we really want to focus on having good facility information. Again, I'm going to use capability versus capacity. What are we able to do? If we have a bunch of stuff, but we don't have a way to communicate to get that stuff, out into the response, moving toward the response, or if we have a bunch of stuff and nobody knows how to use it, and again, I hate to use, school buses during Katrina. There's nobody to drive the buses, kind of thing. But also the communication resources versus the ability to communicate. And what I mean is there are tons of communities who have awesome 800 megahertz and other communications capability, but they, or capacity, I guess, but they don't really have capability with it. And so an example is we conducted a hospital emergency communications system drill. And the idea was that the hospitals had developed this plan. This was a multi-region event, and it was just a simple little drill, but hospitals had developed a plan to be able to communicate using an 800 megahertz system statewide. And so we did a roll call on channel 1, and that's what they had always used. But part of this drill was to test their ability to actually communicate. And so we asked them to then turn to channel 2 and provide and simultaneously provide bed status on their bed status board. Well, the two things we learned was, one, a lot of hospitals didn't really know how to use their bed status board in real time. They knew how to look at it, but they didn't really know how to populate it in real time. 2, and this was just maddening, was that let's say that Will, me, turned my radio to channel 2 and it says MAC 2. And then Sarah turns her radio to channel 2 and it says Metrolina 1. Well, clearly our radios are programmed differently. So then Sarah takes her dial and she turns it around until she finds the channel that reads MAC 2, which is the same title that Will's radio has, just on a different actual place in the radio. And then she keys it up and tries to call me, and actually it turns out that her MAC 2 and my MAC 2 are on a different frequency. It's different frequencies titled the same thing. And I know that North Carolina's system is a little different, but I think it draws the point that that sometimes our resources are different than our ability to communicate. We have a bed tracking system and an 800 system, and the truth is there's either nobody that knows how to use it or they can't formulate the message to be able to send that out. So those are some of the practical thoughts that we have about how to make this work regionally. So a ton of information dumped to you guys. What I wanted to do was just take a minute at the end and see if there are any concerns, outstanding needs, anybody has any best practices to share. If you're thinking about jumping off, please don't jump off yet without thinking about completing the SurveyMonkey, and I know that's in the chat feature on the right. We'd love to have your feedback because that's going to help us develop the workshops. And I thought I had the workshop information in here. I know the workshop information is going to go out to you guys, but is there anything that anybody thinks we should add to the workshop? Is there any detail that you want to add to what I've talked about so far? Again, this is designed to sort of be a teaser and prepare you for how we're going to work together. That workshop should be very hands-on so that you leave with information and resources to be able to improve what you do at your facility and ultimately within your region. So concerns, needs, best practices, anything?
Hey, Will, so just let me point out again, I put the SurveyMonkey link up in the chat box. So again, as Will said, we'd appreciate any replies to that. I also, within the handouts, is the PowerPoint for this presentation, the flyer for the webinars as well as the workshops, and then there was a request for the Kaiser HVA so that people could play around with it, and that is actually up there. So I do have a question from Michelle. Let me just address the workshops real quick, and then we'll come back to that. The workshops, there are 3 scheduled, 1 in each region. December 8th is going to be at Triad at their warehouse in Moxville. December 9th will be in Asheville and Matt Rack will be coordinating that. December 11th will be the Metrolina one, and we're actually going to do it during our quarterly meeting. We're hoping that'll increase attendance. One thing I do want to add about MATRACS is apparently the Western County Emergency Managers work together to develop their HVAs instead of simply doing county HVAs. So I think that's going to be sort of a unique opportunity to look at how did they decide to do the regional approach.
Yeah.
So those, Travis spoke with them at EM today or somewhere. And they will actually be at MATRAC to discuss it. We may try to steal one of them from one of the counties to also go to Triad and Metrolina. That would be great.
Yeah.
So one of the questions from Michelle is it standard practice for healthcare facilities to mirror their HVAs with local or county HVAs? Typically, and we'll chime in if I'm wrong on this, typically hospitals have created their HVAs in a silo. Some hospitals, though, actually do work closely with their counties and either have the county review it to see if it makes sense, or they'll actually have them participate in the HVA development. That I have actually seen change a lot of hospital HVAs based on sort of what the real risks are in the county. As far as being the same, they will have the same external hazards potentially, but yeah, the internal hazards are going to be very different. IT might not be a very critical issue for the county, but for a hospital, if that goes down, it's going to really hamper their infrastructure. So they should be, like, one shouldn't be preparing for a tsunami while another is preparing for a volcano, and neither of which are in the entire region, but they aren't going to be identical. The other question, and Michelle says, thank you. And then Pat did just comment on that the HVA the Joint Commission does require the HVA be presented to county leaders, and that is correct. And Pat, I'm fairly sure you'll agree that often is not really enough to help develop a good HVA, but that's what Joint Commission requires. But that could simply be an email, and I know some hospitals do that. But she also added on, healthcare staff really need to know the known community hazards as they build their HVA, and that is correct. And then Pat did have a question. Will participants be completing an HVA during the workshop to the extent that it could be presented as the annual HVA? Will?
So the challenge with that is, and if there's background noise, sorry, I happen to be where fire alarm tones just went off. I thought it was somewhere quiet. So the challenge with that will be that they will do as much as they can, but it still is going to require some vetting and some support from their particular people. So, like, if you bring a few people to the workshop, we're going to work through and try to develop the detail, but you think about, you still need to vet it with your facilities people and your leadership, or various agencies to get input. So in terms of presenting it, you'll have all the tools, resources, and hopefully we want to take the information you have and get it organized in a way that makes sense. But I just don't know who. It would depend on who attended, and how much real world, people often say, oh, I need to check with the National Weather Service on that to find out what the instances of that are, for my facility, or we need to look at our flood maps and see. So that's the only hesitation I have about saying yes, they will have something that can be presented. Does that make sense? Sarah, anybody?
It makes sense to me. I also think there's no way we can actually get all the way through an entire HVA in this amount of time for everyone. So I think questions will, and engagement will determine how far we get.
Yeah, I think right. It's our goal is to really equip you to go and do very good on your HVA, and hopefully to do some of the work while we're there. Anybody else? Questions, concerns, thoughts?
Well, apparently the person that I've been communicating with, I thought was Travis. It was actually Mark. So we do have Mark Stepp on the webinar as well. He is just logged on under Metrolina's name. But he just can't unmute. That's why I wanted to jump in and give us the information on EM. So I misspoke. He spoke with their county emergency managers.
Gotcha. That's good. Yeah, that'll be great to hear how they go about that. So I know that Sarah will provide her contact information. I provide mine for everybody. Just in case you have questions or want to share something with me or have some input on something we should cover in the workshop, you're free to talk with any of your coalition coordinators. They're all going to be very involved with me as we move forward developing content for the workshop and continuing that process. But always interesting to hear even just some anecdotal things of we learned this or this is how we do it. That's always great to hear that feedback as well, so feel free to share. I'm done with my piece of it. Sarah, anything from you?
No, I just really want to thank all of y'all for joining us, and I am going to work on converting this and figuring how to get it posted so we can share it to other people. We did have 2 opportunities for it, but as we all know, everybody is very, very busy, so we do want to keep it available. We intentionally scheduled the workshops for December, to try to get more attendees, but also to give people time to recruit some interest. We are, there, we can only have sort of a certain number of people there, so probably up to about 35 or 40 people. So priorities, ideally we are going to get hospitals and EM there and really the healthcare focus for this. If we need to do more workshops later, all you need to do is let your coalition leader or let me know, and we'll look at getting grant funding for more. So if there's more things you feel that we could do or should do, let us know. We'll try to get funding to do it because we really want to make sure you have the tools you need to do your job.
Any other questions or anything come in, Sarah, while you were talking? Otherwise,
nope. A couple of great jobs, and thank you.
Yep. Yeah, I'm with Sarah. Thank you guys for participating. It's pretty awesome that we've had this many people participate, and that gives me hope that the workshops will be very productive. Yeah, thanks, and Sarah, thanks for helping me facilitate and drive all this today. And I'm done. So I guess Sarah, you can end the recording and the meeting. Thank you all again.
I will stop the recording, but I'm going to actually leave this up for just another 5 minutes or so, just in case people need access to that link or to download documents.
Cool.
So thank you all. Have a great day.